and welcome to my first lesson on history. In this lesson, we're going to look at three things. The first of which being the way you're examined in the history course, the second being the assessment objectives, and the last, something that's specific to the history I'm going to be teaching, which is all about Marxism. Just to specify, this is the AS spec from Edexcel for 2015, and it's option E, so Communism. First things first, let's look at the way you're going to be examined. I know it's early days yet, but it's always worth considering the exams right from the get-go. I've split this up into AS and A-level. I understand that some people aren't going to be taking the AS, but all of the stuff I'm going to be teaching in this course is all going to be relevant for the A-level too. Also, I'm not going to refer to A-level as A-level, I'm going to refer to it as A2. I think it just makes so much more sense, because the whole thing to me is A-level. First off, if you are doing the AS, you have paper 1, which is the breadth study, and that's on the Soviet Union. It's worth 60% and it's 2 hours 15 minutes long. It's quite a tough exam because you're writing for such a long period of time, but obviously it is worth more, so it makes sense. Paper 2 is the depth study, and in that you look at the GDR. That's worth 40% and it's an hour and a half. It's probably the easier of the two exams in terms of just writing, but the content is different to the Soviet Union. Going on to A2, the content you study for paper 1 at AS is the same content for paper 1 at A-level or A2. Same goes for paper 2. Paper 3 is something I'm not going to go into much in this course. It's either going to be British warfare or British Empire, and that is worth 30%. The values of the original AS exams are halved essentially, and there's also a coursework component which comes in at the A-level. Again, I'm not going to go into that much, but it's about 4,000 words and it's on a topic of essentially your choice. I mean, classes tend to all go in the same direction, but there's so much to choose from, I can't really begin to give tips for that. Next up, I'm going to look at the assessment objectives. I'm not going to be able to assign them to questions in the A2 papers, because I haven't really done them yet, and I'm sure you can find that kind of stuff online. But I can assign them to the AS papers, and also give a brief overview of what they actually are. You can find the full definition online, but it's kind of wordy, especially for AO1, so I'm just going to try and explain it the best I can. AO1 I've explained quite simply as answering the question. So if it's a continuity question, you explain the continuity. If it's a success or failure question, you explain whether or not it was a success or failure. In particular with the success or failure questions, you get AO1 marks for creating a set of criteria. So, was an economic policy successful because it improved living standards? Was it successful because it increased steel production? Those are the kind of things you need to think about, and that's what gets you the AO1 marks. It's also for analysis, evaluation of success or failure, essentially just answering the question. Then there's AO2, which is all about analysing source material. Sorry, I didn't say, but AO1 is used for the first two questions of paper 1 and the last question of the GDR paper. They're worth 20 mark questions, generally the AO1s, because they are the longest and perhaps the trickiest. AO2, you use that in paper 2 for the first two questions, and this is just analysing source material. So you might be saying whether or not a source is useful to historians, you might be saying how much of it is correct, how much of it is incorrect. For the first question in paper 2, you're literally just saying why it might be useful. For the second question of paper 2, it's all about is it useful or not useful, and that's where AO2 comes in. And AO3 is all about historical interpretations. What that essentially means is it's all about textbook history. So you'll have historians who've written their view on, say, for this course it's going to be Gorbachev. They've written their view on why the USSR fell. Now, your job isn't to say whether or not it's useful. It definitely is useful because it's done by a historian who's very good at their subject. But what you're doing is you're looking at how they've interpreted history and what they're implying and what you can infer. This is the part of the video where if you're not studying the communist strand of the Edexcel history spec, you can probably turn off unless you're interested in learning a bit about our side of history. I'm going to look at Marxism. Marxism is named after Karl Marx, the German political theorist, philosopher, economist, who lived in the 1800s. He died in 1883, I think. But that's not so important. What is important is his views. He is considered to be one of the most influential people in history. And he wasn't a politician, he wasn't a great warrior or anything, he was just a writer. He came up with communism. Now, communism comes before Marx, but he was instrumental in the Communist Manifesto, him and his mate Engels. And that is kind of where the Russians got their inspiration from. He also wrote Das Kapital, which is, like economics, if you're interested in economics, that's probably something worth looking into. Essentially, Marx saw society split into two different camps. You have the Proletariat and the Bourgeoisie, which I must admit looks really difficult to pronounce, but it's not that hard. So the Proletariat are the working class, essentially. When he was writing, he was living in a time where there was gross gaps in wealth. You had the working class living in what was essentially a slum. You had the bourgeoisie living in palaces. The bourgeoisie are essentially the aristocrats. So they would have been kings, but they also would have been factory owners, landowners. The key kind of aspect of being a part of the bourgeoisie in those times was owning some of the factors of production. So owning factories, owning land, owning shares and stocks, that kind of thing. But also, he had this theory of dialectical history. Dialectical history is all about history following an inevitable kind of path. He was a believer in something called historical materialism, which means you just look at the facts of history. Now, I'm not going to debate whether or not historical materialism is a thing, because there are arguments for or against it, but he saw history as following a very clear flow. Marx basically thought that we started off way back in what is called primitive communism. So he thought that early settlers and hunter-gatherers, those kind of people, they wouldn't have any currency. They would live in a small group. Men would go out and work to the best of their ability. Women would stay home and work to the best of their ability. And that's how things would work. Then you have this shift eventually after the formation of small settlements and small countries and that kind of stuff. You have what is essentially feudalism. Feudalism is kings and queens and people essentially being serfs. And what I mean by that is they would work on land in exchange for food and shelter. And then you have this shift to something called capitalism, which is what we're currently in. Capitalism is the system where you have workers who are in theory free, and they go and work for people who own the factors of production. And this is very much where the proletariat and the bourgeoisie begin to split. In his times, the proletariat would be people working in factories, and the bourgeoisie would essentially be the people owning the factories. And in capitalism, Marx thought that, well, yeah, cool, it's a really, really good system. It produces lots of things, it encourages competition, but it is inevitably inefficient and doomed to fail. And this is why. The bourgeoisie, in his opinion, were endlessly greedy. And they knew that the proletariat produced things, the bourgeoisie paid them, and the proletariat then went and bought the things that they were producing. So, in this kind of exchange of wealth and products, there are two things that the bourgeoisie can do to increase their own profits. One, they can lower wages, or two, they can raise prices. So either the workers are getting paid less, or they're paying more back to the bourgeoisie for the things they're producing. And essentially Marx thought that this would go on to such a degree that workers, the proletariat, would be working essentially for free. They would be enslaved. And this would be a very extreme point in history. At that point, the bourgeoisie, they were in trouble because the proletariat wouldn't have any of that. And they would revolt. They would violently seize back the factors of production. They would take back the factories, they would take back land, they would requisition housing, and then they would create a socialist state. So, how does this tie in with anything that we're going to be learning in our course? It was this essential idea that the proletariat had to revolt, which caused the Soviet Union to come into existence, essentially. There is more to it than that, but these ideas of Marxism created the Soviet Union. Interestingly enough, Marx, when he wrote some of his stuff, I couldn't tell you exactly what it was, but he wrote very specifically that the first revolution will not happen in Russia. It will happen in Britain or Germany. He said Russia was way too backwards to have a revolution. It wasn't industrialized. It hadn't got to the point where the proletariat would have to take back control. In fact, there are arguments that prior to the Russian Revolution, it was basically feudal. And I think you might be able to see some of the issues. The general idea of Marxism and communism is that you get to the point where there is such an excess of stuff, people produce so much that you can simply have whatever you want. The motto used in the Communist Manifesto is from each according to ability, to each according to need. The way I like to think of this is you would have warehouses full of flat screen TVs which you could essentially just take, and the reason you could take it was because everyone else was working really hard because they themselves wanted to live in a society where you can just go and take a flat screen TV. I won't go into communism and its merits or demerits too much. I think there's loads online if you're interested in communism, but these are the kind of main ideas which I think it's important to have in mind going forward in this course. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you next time.